All right, so my name is Olexander Hryb, and I wrote my first book, which is called Understanding Contemporary Russian and Ukrainian Nationalism, Cossack Revival, and Ukraine Security, right? So that's the title of the book. And the map, actually, which is on the front page, is just behind me. It's one of my favorite maps that I often show when I'm delivering lectures on the culture of Eastern Europe. The map was published in 17th century in Holland. It's a map of Ukraine, which was known as a country in 17th century by European geographers. And it has a Polish coat of arms because Ukraine was part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And that's why it is such an interesting historical document. The map has inscription in Ukrainian and the map has inscription in Polish and Latin, which is also exciting because back then Poland incorporated Western Ukraine as the Russia Par, which is in Latin Земля Ruska, or the land of the Rus. And this is an interesting document showing that Rus or Russia or Russia was known as Ukraine back in 17th century, while if we look at the map, the Moscow Ducatis Par or the Great Moscow Principality was not called Russia during the 17th century, not until Peter the Great introduced this name in 1721. So it's just an interesting note, and it relates to mythology of contemporary Russian and Ukrainian nationalism that is sort of fighting over the legacy of Kievan Rus history. So initially, I started to research this book when I was a young PhD student in Poland. I studied at the Graduate School for Social Research in Warsaw, and I was looking for a case study for my PhD that would look at paramilitary nationalist organizations. And I came across the Cossack movement in Odessa in southwestern Ukraine, and that attracted my attention because it was mid-1990s. Soviet Union collapsed a couple of years previously. People who inhabited Soviet Ukraine were former Komsomol party members, so they were ex-Soviet citizens. Cossacks were not known in those times, and from the sociology point of view, it was very exciting to study this new social movement. And I studied both Russian and Ukrainian Cossacks in Odessa. And that's how the whole idea to study Cossacks came about. So the book has a number of chapters on actual Cossacks and Cossack revival, but it deals with such more complicated subjects as national identity, ethnic identity, nations and ethnic communities, the whole concept of nationalism. So the first two chapters, they deal actually with terminology that was used both in the West and in Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia and post-Soviet Ukraine. Basically, there is no single theory of nationalism, fortunately or unfortunately, and I use a working definition suggested by Professor Ernest Gellner, who suggested that nationalism is a political principle that suggests that one culture should coincide with one state. So I use it as a working definition and then elaborate that effectively it's a complex belief system that humankind, mankind is naturally divided into nations. And these nations, they have compatible cultures related to their states, and they become nation states. Nationalism is understood to develop by the end of 18th, beginning of 19th century, when nation states started to replace gradually the age of empires. There are lots of books written on nationalism, and there's lots of magazine publishing articles, and there's lots of views demonizing nationalism, mostly as for being violent and exclusive and the cause of all ills in the world. However, nationalism during the 19th century was sometimes a progressive force when it was replacing colonial regimes or imperial regimes, right? So nationalism could be democratic or it could be anti-colonial. In fact, I am arguing in my book that nationalism is not an ideology in itself. It could be incorporated in different ideologies. So nationalism is a political principle that one culture and one state should coincide, could be incorporated in a variety of ideologies, from constitutional monarchy to liberal modern democracy, or indeed some extreme form of nationalism could be incorporated into ideologies like fascism or Nazi Germany, racist ideology, right? So one of the points I am making in my book is that we live in the age of nationalism, and it's not necessarily going away, even though we have some developments like the European Union, for instance, that suggest that the humankind, or at least Europe, could evolve into a new system or a new society, which is post-nationalist in the sense that the state is not organized around one culture. Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, made a suggestion that the world might develop into a sort of global society where Staatsnation and Kulturnation could be devolved from a nation state. So if we look at the European Union, we could have different national cultures which are part of kind of post-nation state, pan-European state-like formation of European Union. So we could talk about local patriotism in Europe, but not talk about nationalism as a political principle to organize nation states in Europe. Habermas suggested this idea before Brexit, and Brexit is an important precedent showing that the nation state is not necessarily going away. The European Union might develop in this post-nation state political structure, but it's not a given case. So in case of Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian constitution claims that Ukraine should join the European Union and possibly NATO, and that gives Ukrainians an opportunity to join into this European project. So Ukrainian national idea of Ukraine being a Cossack nation could be incorporated into the European Union without Ukrainians retaining their nation state if they ever join European Union as a member country. That was not available to the Russian Federation. Russian Federation leadership never wanted to join the European Union. So initially they inherited the Soviet concept of nations and nation building, and I analyze it in my book in first 2 chapters, showing how the whole terminology used from the Soviet ethnography kind of evolved into ethnogeopolitics in Russia. And Russian Federation leadership started to build Russian Federation as this multi-ethnic community. And effectively they had to deal with the fact that there are various autonomies in Russian Federation that are defined through ethnic terminology, and they wanted to build a political nation, but at the same time they had to deal with this reality of various ethnic communities enshrined in their constitution as being separate entities of part of the Russian Federation. So it's difficult for the Kremlin to build a political nation, considering that constitutionally they include various ethnic communities, and it's difficult to call them a single political nation. And that's not a problem for Ukraine, because Ukraine from the very beginning adopted this civic concept of nation building, and all citizens of Soviet Ukraine were proclaimed to be citizens of Ukraine. Therefore, Ukrainian leadership was building a civic political nation. And this process is ongoing in both countries. But what I found through my Cossack research is that nationalism is not necessarily turning violent if it's not threatened. And we can analyze this situation through the concept of societal security, or security in terms of identity. So Ukrainian identity was threatened by these neo-imperial Russian projects, and I could see from my Cossack studies in Odessa that Ukrainian Cossacks were developing their ideology as opposed to expansionist Russian neo-imperial project. Therefore, Cossack mythology in Ukraine was defensive against Russian expansionism, while Russian Cossack mythology in Ukraine reflected this sort of syndrome of revanchist power. Russia was shrinking during the Soviet Union collapsed, and lots of Cossacks of Russian origin were dreaming that Russia should be restored to its glory. Therefore, Russian Cossack ideology was more expansionist. And I could see back in 1990s that these two types of nationalism, sort of neo-imperial Russian supra-ethnos or Russian civilization nationalism, was on a collision course with Ukrainian civic nationalism expressed in this Cossack nation concept of Ukraine. Yes, history of Cossacks is very interesting, and I was surprised that there is practically no research in English language on contemporary Cossacks. There are some books published on history of Cossacks, but even then, few people realize in the West that there is a distinction between Ukrainian Cossack tradition and Russian Cossack tradition, in the sense that Ukrainian Cossacks evolved 14th, 15th, 17th century as part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they were based in the wild west of eastern Ukraine, so to speak, in the no man's land between the Turkic-speaking nomads invading from the south, from Crimean Khanate, and from the east from other Turkic-speaking nomadic populations. And the sort of established Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth population north of the river Dnipro. So Ukrainian Cossacks evolved as a kind of warrior caste of effectively only men living on uninhabited islands, or they inhabited those islands to build their little fortresses there called Sich. And as Karl Marx said, Cossacks in Ukraine created this first Christian republic because they would elect their chieftains, Ottoman, and they would be effectively like a religious military order living on the border between nomads in the south and several population in the north. The only membership criteria for Ukrainian Cossacks were that A, someone had to be a Christian, and B, someone had to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the elected Ottoman. So that was the history of Ukrainian Cossacks, again, as a military order of men living in a sort of brotherhood of arms, let's say, a warrior caste. Well, Russian Cossacks had a similar social origin, but they settled in different parts of Russia. Initially on the river Don, where Rostov-on-Don is now. But then they moved around Russia during the 17th century, and they settled as far as Ural River. And they also conquered Siberia and moved to the far east. So Russian hosts, they evolved along a different sort of path in terms of being settled population. So Russian Cossacks were married farmers who were working the land, but they also paid their taxes to the Tsars by serving a certain amount of years in the Russian army as light cavalry, right? So that was a difference between Ukrainian Cossacks who didn't recognize any powers initially, and they were a sort of military order living independently. They were not settled in the sense that they lived on these fortified islands on the river Dnieper. And then later on, they were incorporated into military service with Polish kings or Russian Tsars. But essentially, they had this different lifestyle from the Russian Cossacks who lived as a kind of militarized farming population. And that lasted in Ukraine until 18th century, when Catherine the Great disbanded the last Ukrainian Cossack Sich. And Ukrainian Cossacks moved to the Danube River, but also were incorporated into Russian Cossacks moving to the Kuban River. So Kuban Cossacks were speaking Ukrainian up until 1930s. They still sing Ukrainian songs, but they lost the sense of Ukrainian identity in Kuban, mostly lost Ukrainian identity. While Russian Cossacks, they were preserved as settled farmers effectively until the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. They fought against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. Many of them were either killed by the Bolsheviks or emigrated, and then at some point even some Cossack hosts joined the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Right, so the last Cossacks, Russian Cossacks, fought against the Bolsheviks during the Second World War. So Russian Cossacks effectively ceased to exist as cavalry units during Second World War, while the last Ukrainian hosts existed at the end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century. And that also explains the difference in the Cossack revival, because Russian Cossacks still had these imperial memories, family memories, and they sort of evolved in Russia alongside of this neo-imperial ideology. While the Ukrainian Cossacks had to be reinvented effectively in Ukraine, because there was no living tradition that was preserved, and therefore Ukrainian Cossacks in contemporary Ukraine are a little bit like folk and dance societies. So you can compare, for instance, with that population of Scandinavian countries remember themselves as descendants of Vikings. So population of Ukraine remember itself as descendants of Ukrainian Cossacks. Even Ukrainian anthem is saying that Ukrainians are of Cossack origin. But that is a historical fact, and it's a type of historical memory and identity rather than a contemporary Cossack movement as it is in Russia. Another big difference in contemporary Russia and Ukraine is that Russian Federation legislation recognizes Russian Cossacks as separate ethnic community, while Ukrainian Cossacks are recognized in Ukraine as NGOs, non-government organizations. As I said, Russian Federation consists of a number of ethnic communities that have different status and different regional organizations, from autonomous oblast, autonomous regions or krai. They have also their own republics. So Tatars, for instance, have a separate Tatar republic. There is a separate autonomous formation for Buryats, for instance. And Cossacks also achieved this status of separate ethnic community. But it is understood as part of a larger supra-ethnos, Russian ethnos, right? So the whole terminology is strange to Westerners. But there is a hierarchy of ethnic communities in Russia, and Cossacks form an ethnic community in Russian Federation as well. And they are still split along with different hosts, so they have different hosts in different parts of Russia, and they also can combine different ethnic traits. So you could have a Cossack who is an ethnic Russian, you could have a Cossack who is a Kalmyk, for instance, right? But they are still defined alongside of these ethnic definitions. And ethnicity, in fact, is sort of reinvented in the modern world. It's all about certain cultural traits. It's about language, it's about rituals, it's about myth of origin. So ethnicity in the modern world is sort of reinvented. And as I said, Ukrainian Cossacks reinvented themselves alongside of their tradition, and Russian Cossacks keep reinventing themselves on a kind of federal level and also local levels. Yes, so contemporary Russian Cossack movement could be understood in terms of kind of two wings of Russian Cossack revival. So on the one hand, you have descendants of Cossacks who preserve their memories about their grandparents being Cossacks and traditions related to the military service and uniforms and songs and all that, right? These people are different in different parts of Russia. They have slightly different traditions. They tend to be ethnic Russians, but not necessarily. As I said, they could be Kalmyk Cossacks, so they could be Turkic-speaking. They are expected to be Christian, but that's not necessarily the fact. And by Russian legislation, they are considered to be a separate ethnic community. So they understand that they could be Cossacks, but also could be Russians. And then that's where the interesting definition, the difference is between Russian language and the English, right? So there are two terms that Russians use to describe themselves. One is Ruskiye, which is like ethnic Russians, and one is Россияне, which is sort of a civic term describing all people living in Russia. So you could be Россиянин in the civic sense, and you could be a Tatar or Dagestan origin or Chechen Россияnin, right? So you could be Russian of different type of origin. So some Cossacks consider themselves to be Россияне, so a civic definition, but of Cossack origin, right? But some Cossacks would say that they are ethnic Russians and they are Cossacks as well. And to a large extent, Russian Cossacks evolved into this sort of paramilitary organizations in Russia where the origin is not necessarily a deciding factor, which some people just joined Cossack formation as private military companies to make their living out of this sort of lifestyle. So it's not a homogeneous movement. Some Cossacks in Russia consider themselves to be ethnic Cossacks, and some of them actually are quite have separate identity from being Россияне, right? So they would never call themselves Ruskiye, for instance. They would call themselves Cossacks. But they join into this ideology of the Russian world and sort of supra-ethno-Russian state or Russian civilization. And that's where we have the contradiction between Russia being mostly Russian-speaking culture of Slavic origin, and Russia being a large country with a variety of population that is not ethnically Russian. And this contradiction was to a certain extent addressed through the ideology of Eurasianism. Eurasianism originates from 1920s, where Russian monarchists tried to explain what happened with Russia during the Bolshevik revolutions, and they arrive at the conclusion that Russia has a unique destiny. It's not a normal nation state. It's a unique spiritual Russian civilization, and it's based on the symbiotic relationship between Slavic population, ethnic Russians, Ruskiye, and so-called Turanian minority or Turkic-speaking peoples of Russia. So these Eurasianists, like Knyaz Trubetskoy, Prince Trubetskoy, they introduced concept of symbiotic relationship between the Mongols and the Slavs that created this new entity and that existed well into 20th century. Contemporary Russian thinkers picked up on this ideology during the 1980s, 90s, like Lev Gumilov developed his own concept of Eurasianism, and he was claiming that Russians is this unique combination of ethnic Slavs and ethnic Turkic-speaking population, which is not Slavic population. And it sort of makes sense for Russia because, as I said, it's a huge country with a variety of different people living there. So this ideology of Eurasianism made sense because it was kind of a unifying ideology suggesting that Turkic minority and Russian-speaking ethnic Russians could be part of this Russian civilization defined in non-nation state terms. So that was the historical development of Eurasianist ideology. Now, unfortunately, the new Eurasianism in Russia became discredited after thinkers like Alexander Dugin introducing new, sort of almost neo-fascist concepts of Eurasianism that suggest that Russian messianic idea should forcefully incorporate Belarusians and Ukrainians as well. And we can also see that New Eurasianism became part of the Kremlin ideology, and there is a chapter in my book on Putin's Eurasianism, where I try to analyze to what extent this new Eurasianism became part of the official ideology of the Kremlin. And to some extent, Putin's pronouncements about Russians and Ukrainians being one people, they explain this expansionism from Russian Federation to Ukraine. It's all based on this new Eurasianist ideology that sort of includes our people into this concept of Russian civilization based on the Russian language, culture, and it, according to Gumilov, it's not based on social identities, it's based on biology. It's based on the so-called passionarność, or kind of energy that exists between people. And that's why this type of new Eurasianism thinking is dangerous, because when you start talking about nations as biological organisms, like Gumilov did, you can't really make any compromises, right? Because you can't compromise on biological parts of the same organism. And that explains this collision course that we have between Russia and Ukraine, because Ukrainian independence threatens this Russian Eurasian ideological construct, because this construct cannot imagine that Russian world could exist without Ukraine and Belarus, while Ukrainian nation-state aspirations clearly are linked to the European Union, and that's why there is a clash of this new Russian civilization with European Union, with Ukraine being squeezed between the two. Yes, contemporary Cossack organizations in Ukraine and southeastern Russia, or occupied Crimea and Donbas, are on the collision course in terms of ideology as well. So Ukrainian Cossack organizations as NGOs hold beliefs of a civic Ukrainian nation state, and they are supporting the idea of Ukrainian independent Ukrainian nationhood. Now, they are not defined, so Ukrainian Cossacks not necessarily define Ukrainian nation in ethnic terms, because anyone could become a member of Ukrainian Cossack organization. However, they clearly defend Ukrainian statehood. Russian Cossack organizations in Ukraine that used to exist under the umbrella of all Ukrainian Cossack organization mostly were sharing into this ideology of Russian civilization, Russian super-ethnos, supporting the unification of Russian Federation with former Soviet republics, including Ukraine and Belarus. So again, Russian Cossacks not necessarily viewed, Russian Cossacks not necessarily had an ethnic exclusivist view or worldview, but they supported this neo-imperial Russian project of reunification. That's why you have Russian Cossack organizations supporting Russian culture expanding into Ukraine, while Ukrainian Cossack organizations were defending Ukraine from this expansionism, and they were defending Ukrainian language as the core for Ukrainian culture and nationhood. It was quite easy to distinguish Ukrainian and Russian Cossacks in Odessa when I did my research, because Ukrainian Cossacks would speak Ukrainian, sing Ukrainian folk songs, and they would dream of independent Ukrainian state, part of the European Union. While Russian Cossacks would speak Russian, they would sing Russian songs, and they would support the expansion of Russian Federation into Ukraine. So you can see here ideological clash, and you can see that identity of both Cossack movements was threatened by their mutually exclusive aspirations. So back in 1990s, nobody could imagine that this collision course would lead to bloodshed. But when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, Russian Cossack organizations moved into Ukraine, especially into Donbas region, as paramilitary organizations, and hostilities started between Russian and Ukrainian Cossacks in Donbas. However, the difference between Russian and Ukrainian situation is that Ukrainian Cossacks never formed any paramilitary or military formations in defense of Ukraine. Ukrainian Cossacks joined Ukrainian armed forces or National Guard, or other voluntary battalions, and they fought against the Russian hybrid invasion as members of Ukrainian armed forces. Russian Cossacks could do the same. They could join legitimate Russian military formations in Crimea, for instance, but they also joined paramilitary organizations, Cossacks, private military companies effectively fighting in Donbas and in Crimea. So yes, both Russian and Ukrainian Cossacks ended up fighting each other in Donbas, for instance, but Ukrainian Cossacks were members of the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukraine had 5 waves of mobilization, so everyone who wanted to take part in fighting could do that legitimately, while Russian Cossacks had to be disguised in these paramilitary, private military companies, because Russian invasion of Donbas took form of a disguised, covert hybrid form. What surprised me when I was studying my Cossacks in Odessa in 1990s is the very fact that former Soviet citizens of various ethnic background decided to join paramilitary Cossack organizations in principle. 1990s was, in a sense, a period of time when people were not interested in ideology. Russians and Ukrainians were struggling with economic reforms, poverty, collapse of the former Soviet industries. Most people were trying to survive, and most people were not interested in paramilitary organizations. Also, on an official level, independent Ukraine and independent Russian Federation had quite a good relationships. So President Yeltsin in the 1990s used to say that every Russian bureaucrat has to wake up in the morning and think, what can we do for our brotherly Ukraine? Nobody could take him seriously, probably, but it just shows you the spirit of sort of peaceful coexistence between Russian and Ukrainian state back in 1990s. So what drew my attention is that people who joined the Cossacks, they were preparing themselves to join the fight. And it was difficult to predict back then why would they do that, because officially neither Ukrainian state nor Russian state had any hostile intentions against each other. And that's when I started to look at the different concept of security, right? So traditional approach to state security or nation-state security couldn't explain that situation. That's why I looked at the concept of societal security, and that's security in terms of identity of people. And that explains the situation with Cossack revival much better, because, as I said, Ukrainian patriots were threatened with Russian expansionism from the very beginning of Ukrainian independence. That's why they joined, maybe unconsciously, paramilitary Cossack organizations, preparing themselves mentally to defend Ukrainian independence. And it was the same with Russian Cossacks. So let's say Russian patriots who wanted to rebuild great Russia or make Russia great again, they unconsciously sort of followed the path, joining the paramilitary organizations, preparing for a fight in the future. So as I said, neither Ukrainian state security nor Russian Federation state security was threatened in 1990s. The states were not on a collision course, but nationalist ideologies were on a collision course. National identities were threatened by this mutual exclusivity of Ukrainian nationhood and Russian neo-imperial construct, right? So this was something that drew my attention, and I was trying to research it and understand it better, and I came up with this concept of societal security as a useful framework to analyze Cossack revival. And unfortunately, I was right in the sense that both ideologies led to confrontation on a rhetorical level that later on became a real war once the Kremlin introduced new ideology of Eurasianism into the political discourse between Russia and Ukraine. So both Ukrainian and Russian states were on a collision course as well. But it's a very good point, actually, that my book is written largely for for Western English-speaking audience. And as I said, there are no books in English on contemporary Cossacks. So my contribution is actually to explain the difference between Russian and Ukrainian Cossacks to the wider Western audience. But also, I attempted to look at the possible conflict resolution scenarios available between Russia and Ukraine. As we know that the conflict is far from being over, and Russian troops are massing on the Ukrainian border, threatening peace in Ukraine once again. And this framework of security community between NATO countries or European Union countries and no war community with Russia or no peace community with Russia between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, it gives a theoretical framework to think what could be done in this situation. So Russian political elites chose the ideology that leads them to confrontation. President Yeltsin didn't want to incorporate Ukraine into Russian Federation. He didn't choose expansionist ideology for Russian Federation. And that's why the peaceful coexistence between Russian Federation and Ukraine was possible. Now, President Putin chose this new Eurasianism as ideology for Russian Federation for various internal reasons, as I mentioned, just to keep peace within Russian Federation. But unfortunately, that new Eurasianist ideology led to confrontation with other former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, to certain extent, Belarus and Kazakhstan. So I'm arguing in my book that the political choice that elites make could lead them into this confrontation. But this choice is not inevitable, right? Nationalism doesn't have to be exclusive. Ukrainians chose, or Ukrainian political leadership chose, integration with European Union and NATO to be part of that security community, of that safe neighborhood that takes them to the West, to their cultural roots in Central Europe. And Russian Federation doesn't have to follow this expansionist ideology of new Eurasianism that leads to war and confrontation. So the choice is always there, right? And my book just illustrates how choices made by the elites lead to consequences in the real life and potential armed conflict. So nationalism itself is not necessarily good or bad because it's ethnic or civic. Nationalism is only a political principle that could be incorporated in different ideologies. So Russian ideology of new Eurasianism is expansionist and potentially violent, and that's why this version of nationalism leads to war, while Ukrainian nationalism is civic and it takes Ukraine into the safe neighborhood of security community with European Union. And that's also a political choice. So this choice is always available to people and their political leaderships. So Ukrainian nationalism was demonized from the very beginning by the Russian Federation leadership intentionally to portray new government in Ukraine under President Poroshenko as a neo-Nazi junta that is threatening ethnic Russians in Ukraine because it was supported by Washington and Brussels. So it was a part of hostile narrative and part of the Russian information warfare machine to portray Ukrainian nationalism as a type of neo-Nazi junta. And many Western observers, especially media outlets, never really understood Ukraine sufficiently to figure out that this is completely irrelevant to the situation on the ground. One of the arguments I present in my book is that if we look at the parliamentary elections in Ukraine for the 20 years previous to the armed conflict with Russia, Ukrainian population never voted for right-wing organizations and never elected them to the parliament. Ukrainians had a couple of sort of nationalist MPs, but that was exceptions to the rules. So Ukrainians are one of the most tolerant people in Central and Eastern Europe, but it wasn't understood in 2014. And a lot of commentators just followed the Russian point of view about this militant Ukrainian nationalism. Now, this situation isn't understood much better, but I simply give a deep dive into the history, theory of nations and nationalism in Soviet Union, in post-Soviet Ukraine and Russia. I looked at the terminology used in both countries. I looked at Western concepts. I compare them. I show the differences and similarities. And I provide in this book the cognitive instruments to deal with both Russian and Ukrainian nationalism and the armed conflict that followed the confrontation between Russian Federation and Ukraine since 2014. It's a good question. So Ukrainian political elites from the very beginning were trying to build a political nation, and they were defining Ukrainian people, Ukrainский народ, in terms of civic nationalism. So all citizens of former Soviet Ukrainian Republic received citizenship rights, unlike in the Baltic states, for instance, and they all had the choice to be Ukrainians. One reason for that was that Ukrainian political elite in Kyiv were mostly former Soviet nomenclatura, who were mostly Russian-speaking. They were products of Soviet ideology and mentality. So if we look at President Kuchma, for instance, he was the only MP in the Ukrainian Soviet parliament who voted against independence. Initially, he claimed that he was ethnic Russian, but once he became president, he changed his biography and became Ukrainian in his passport. So he didn't know what Ukrainian ideology he could offer to a nation state that he was building, right? Therefore, Ukrainian nationalism never had an ethnic content because Ukrainian political elites didn't know what does it mean to be Ukrainian, right? So in a sense, Cossack revival in Ukraine was trying to reinvent for Eastern Ukrainians the whole concept of what is it to be Ukrainian, right? And that means speaking Ukrainian language, singing Ukrainian songs, being a good citizen of modern Ukraine, defending Ukrainian statehood. So that was a national revival in Eastern Ukraine to kind of create this concept of Cossack Ukraine. And Ukrainian political leadership never actually emphasized any special rights for ethnic Ukrainians. In fact, as I said, most governments in Ukraine were dominated by culturally Russian-speaking or culturally Russian, modern Ukrainian individuals who didn't really know much about Ukrainian ethnic culture. However, this confrontation with Russian Federation led Ukrainian elites towards closer integration with the European Union. So effectively, they had to adopt this civic concept of nationhood and enshrine in Ukrainian constitution intention to join the European Union, with all the consequences of adopting market economy and liberal democracy associated with the European Union, and especially NATO as well. So Ukrainian political leadership didn't have much choice but to adopt this Western concept of benign nationalism, understanding Ukrainian people as all citizens of Ukraine. I think as civic nationalism in Ukraine turned out to be quite strong. I think that Ukrainians surprised themselves and surprised the rest of the world, and especially Russia, when they turned up in defense of Ukraine. Then Ukraine was invaded by the Russian Federation in 2014 in Crimea and then later in Donbas. So Ukrainian citizens, irrespectively of the language they spoke, of their formal ethnicity recorded in their passports, they joined Ukrainian armed forces, joined volunteer battalions, and they successfully fought back against the Russian hybrid invasion. there is no exact statistics, but approximately half of the Ukrainians who fought against the Russian hybrid invasion were Russian speakers. Initially, whole Ukrainian armed forces used Russian language as a language of instructions in the armed forces. Some volunteer Ukrainian battalions using Ukrainian language, but very often soldiers would switch to Russian because that was the language of instructions they were used to, and that was just easier to communicate in terminology that they knew from the Soviet army. So in terms of defending the Ukrainian nation state, the Ukrainians did quite well in terms of nationalist mobilization in defense of their state. Now, when it comes to actually overlapping Ukrainian nation state to Ukrainian culture, that's where there is certain ambiguity even now, because Ukrainian culture and language is sort of optional for citizens to use in their private life. And Ukrainian state introduced only a couple of years ago the requirement that all Ukrainian citizens have to study Ukrainian language, and that was considered to be controversial in Russia, and in some Western media outlets there was some discontent why Ukrainian state is forcing everybody to study in Ukrainian language in Ukrainian schools. But that's actually not unusual in the European Union. And most of countries in the European Union, they have one state language, and all state schools teach in that language. So Ukraine is not an exception. So in a sense, Ukraine is becoming a normal European state where state schools teach in Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian armed forces use a language of that nation state. So Ukrainians are becoming sort of more like everybody else in Europe. But that is a problem for this expansionist Russian ideology, and that's why both countries are on a collision course, Russian Federation and Ukraine. Yes, so the appendices with my Cossack fieldwork research reflects my research done in the 1990s when I visited Cossack communities in Odessa region. When I studied Ukrainian and Cossack and Ukrainian and Russian Cossack communities. And that was the basis of the book as such, because that led me into this topic in the first place. So Ukrainian Cossack communities organized themselves along the Black Sea coast very much in response to the appearance of Russian Cossacks in that region. So effectively, as Serhiy Plokhy mentioned in his books in 1993, that Ukrainian Cossack myth was a counter myth to the Russian expansionist ideology. So Ukrainian Cossack organization popped up in that region saying that this is a Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian Cossacks always inhabited this territory since the Dunaj Sich or Danube Sich times. And Russian Cossacks have no right to claim this territory for the Novorossiya project, right? And the Russian Cossacks appeared in the same region at the same time, using very much sort of 19th century Russian imperial tradition. Then certain Russian troops were called Black Sea Cossacks, and they were part of the Russian imperial army as light cavalry. So in a sense, both historical traditions were correct, because various Cossacks served in different parts of the Cossack formation of Russian imperial army, and they had the right to exist. But it was clear back in 1990s that these movements, they can reinvent traditions. There is no physical link in the memory, or there's no real link in the memory of neither Russian nor Ukrainian Cossacks to historical events from the end of 18th, beginning of 19th century, right? So it was a modern reinvention of traditions. And as I said, it was interesting to follow up these movements in the last 25 years and to see how both Russian and Ukrainian Cossacks ended up fighting each other in Donbas many years later, despite the fact that nobody could predict that 25 years ago. Yes, that's true. So I write in my book that it was clear from 1990s that Russian Cossacks were using this Russian neo-imperial ideology to claim their right for Crimea and Donbas, maybe even entire Novorossiya construct, by using all this Cossack mythology, which was really Russian neo-imperial mythology related to the ideology of Eurasianism. So one of the first Russian separatist leaders in Crimea, President Mishkov, was elected to be a Russian Cossack president, right? And Cossacks from Don region even wanted to establish a Don Cossack army embassy in Crimea. Now that was successfully prevented by the Ukrainian security services in 1990s. However, then Russian Federation decided to move in with their regular troops in 2014. Cossacks were used simply as a kind of hybrid, local hybrid force, presenting this idea of a civil conflict in Crimea, while really it was a hybrid invasion, and Cossacks were simply playing the role of locals. So the book is a result of my lifelong fascination with the topic of Cossack revival in Russia and Ukraine. I would like only to say thank you to all people who supported me on this quest and helped me to research the book in the first place. And that's Professor Chernysh from Lviv State University, Professor Rejkowski from Polish Academy of Science, Professor Claire Wallace from Central European University, who helped me to set up my field research in the first place, and also special thanks to Professor Andreas Umland, who collected this series of books on Ukrainian voices and helped to publish this book in 2020. So this is just a big thank you to all people who supported this research and made this book possible. Thank you very much for finding time and your great effort to bring these books alive with video interviews.